To use ivory black. Now if you have a different brand of paint, totally fine, just make sure you're using ivory black. We're going to use titanium whites, okay? And then we're also going to put out some of our Gamblin solvent-free gel as well. That's going to help us when we're actually applying the paint. So we are going to mix out a value scale, and this is going to be a really essential skill for all of the paintings that we make in this class, not just for when we're working in black and white, but as we start to introduce color as well. So let's get started. Paint. I also have my palette knife out, okay? That's what I'm going to be mixing my colors with. So that looks like this. Again, if you have a slightly different one, that's okay. Should generally look like this though. It's a knife for mixing paint. And then I also have some paper towels at the ready. I'm going to need to use these as I'm mixing things out to keep my paint piles separate. Alright, so let's start by, one more thing. We have our palette box. Now this is great because there's a top that goes to this box. If you mix a bunch of paint and you haven't used it all by the end of your painting session, you can put that lid on the box and save the paint, use it the next day, or even it will stay wet for a couple of days at least. Okay, so this is a stay wet palette. And then the palette paper, I've put that within my palette box. You want to make sure before you start mixing out any paint that the waxy side is up. So if you fill it with your finger, it should feel waxy. If it feels like paper, you have the wrong side facing up, and that paper is going to absorb the oil in your paint and make you a sad painter. So make sure the waxy side is up. Okay, all right. We are also going to be applying the paint in 4 different ways onto our value scales. So you want to mix quite a bit of paint in this session. And any extra paint that you have at the end, you can use to tone canvases, get them ready for our next projects. So mix a bit more than probably you think you should. One big thing I noticed with a lot of my beginning painters is that they will mix these tiny little piles of paint and then they don't have enough to complete their project, which will make you quite sad because that means you then have to remix the paint and try to match what you mixed before, and that can be quite difficult. Okay, let's place our paint over here, and then also putting out some of the solvent-free gel. The solvent-free gel, you can add a bit to your paint. Don't mix it in right now, we'll add it as we're painting, but it helps your paint be a little bit more fluid as you're painting on your canvas. Okay, so I'm just going to keep a paper towel in my hand to wipe off my palette knife as I go. Alright, so from the very beginning we want to start to build good habits. So we're putting our paint out of the tube right up at the top of our palette, not in the middle. You want to leave this middle space for mixing, so give yourself room for that. So I'm putting these bigger paint piles right from the tube at the top of my palette. Then I'm going to mix down these value scales. And I'm going to try to keep my value scale going in a line so I can compare the values as I go. So I'm not mixing randomly all over the palette. That makes it hard to compare your values and really see what's going on. Alright, so I'm also going to start by mixing a middle gray, like a big pile of a middle gray. Okay, so now before I go into my white pile, I'm going to wipe that black off so that it doesn't taint this pure white pile. Okay, same thing if you have a bunch of white on your palette knife, don't just go directly into the black. You want to keep these colors separated so that if you're using a pure amount of black or using a pure amount of white as you're placing that on the canvas, that there's not a black or a white streak that comes through, okay? So you want to keep things clean as we go. All right, I'm going to start by mixing a mid-tone gray, and then I will be mixing other values using this mid-tone gray. So we're learning some mixing strategies for creating all these different values. So rather than trying to create 10 different values, each mixing purely from black and white, we're going to mix a little bit differently. We're going to start by mixing a gray, and then we'll take this and adjust it going both ways. So that makes it a little bit easier to get all those in-between values, versus if you're trying to mix every single value purely from black and white, that can be quite difficult. And you might end up with huge piles of one particular value because you're trying to adjust it and trying to adjust, you end up adding more and more paint. So we're trying to be a little bit more strategic in our mixing approach by starting with the middle of our value scale, using that middle to adjust it going both ways. And this is an approach, again, that we will use throughout the semester, even as we start to introduce color onto our palettes. We'll be working in a similar way. Okay, and I'm also trying to control the size of this pile right now, so I'm taking my paint, I'm mashing my palette knife all the way through it. You can see that little bits of white came through, so you want to make sure that you've fully mixed every value pile that we're creating here. So again, that as you're painting, you don't take some of this, put it on the canvas, and then a white streak comes through. So you want to mix it fully. Okay, so let's scrape up this little bit that's going out on the edges. And we're gonna make this pile a little bit smaller. Now, I'm gonna take, oops, of course. Okay, super professional. All right, there we go, guys. Okay, I am going to take some of this mid-tone gray that I've mixed, and I'm going to start to bring it out on both sides. And then this will be my lighter side through here, and this will be my darker side or my shadow side through here. So I'm going to put a bigger pile of gray right there. Then I'm just going to use the rest on my palette knife, put another note right there, another one right here. Okay, same thing on the other side. So let's grab some more of this gray. I'm going to put a bigger pile right there, a little bit less, and just a little bit less. All right, so let's try to wipe off the excess so we're not wasting paint. Okay. All right, so now what I'm going to do, I'll start with the lighter side. And again, wiping off my palette knife as I go before I go into this big pile. All right, let's grab some white. Now we're gonna take this white and add it into this pile. And again, mix that completely. Let's get a little bit more white. Okay. So we're getting a very light gray right here. Scrape that up, press that paint back down, and mix it fully. Okay, so now what I'm going to do actually is grab some more of this really light gray that I just mixed, and rather than going in with white into this next little pile of gray, I'm going to use this light gray that's on my palette knife. So I'm mixing this value scale out in a way where I know for sure that this is a really light gray. This gray has more of the mid gray in here, and then some of this lighter gray, but not a bunch of pure white. So I absolutely know that this is going to be darker than this combination. So that's where we're getting into a strategy for paint mixing rather than trying to mix every single value purely from black and white. We're using the other grays that we've mixed to create this scale. So we're controlling it in a way where we know that as we mix up, it's going to be getting darker because it's getting more of that mid-gray. All right, now I'm going to repeat that same idea. So I'm going to use what's on my palette knife, grab a little bit more of this light gray, and then add it into this pile. As you mix your value scale, you also want to be squinting your eyes at the values that you're mixing to see the darks and the lights clearly. So when you squint, it allows you to see those darks and lights more clearly. And if everything just looks like one note of gray, that means you need to adjust both ends of your value scale. If everything just looks really dark, that means you need to be adding more light, and vice versa. If everything looks too light, it means you need to heighten the dark areas. Okay, this one I'm going to add a tiny bit more white into to make it just look lighter than the mid-gray right here, just a tiny bit, okay? I don't want to overpower this mixture to make it go lighter than that, so I'm just using a little bit of my pure white in there. So when you're mixing, you also want to build things up gradually, just like how I just added a tiny bit of white into this to make it a bit lighter. I don't want to go with a huge pile of white into there because then it's going to throw it off from the rest of my values that I've mixed. Okay, so that's giving us our lighter end of our value scale. Okay, now we're going to address the darker end. So now I'm going to start over on the other side. I'm going to have this little tiny pile of mid-tone gray, and I'm going to take some black and add that into here. Okay, so that's just a touch lighter than pure black. Alright, so then I'll take some of this, maybe take a little bit of my black too, and I'll go into this next pile of gray. These I made a little bit too close together, so I'm trying to just mix them but still keep them separate because they'll be separate little notes of values on my scale. Okay, now that's definitely lighter. Okay, now again, taking some of this dark gray that I just mixed and adding that into this larger pile of my mid-tone gray. And then if you need to make that a touch darker, you can grab just a tiny bit of black, but don't overdo it. And I will make this just a touch darker. So I'm grabbing just a tiny little bit of black. Okay, I'm gonna mix that in. Black especially is gonna go a long way. It can be really overpowering. And you're gonna find that as we dive deeper into paint mixing this semester. Some colors don't have a very high tinting capacity. Some really do, so just a little tiny bit of paint can really overpower other paints, and you'll just get more familiar with that as you go. Alright. Okay guys, and we are doing a 10-point value scale going from pure white to pure black. So let's see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we'll do one more. And I think we could add one lighter gray on this end. So what I'm going to do, and first really, now that I've been on the darker side of my value scale, I want to make sure my palette knife is clean. So I'm going to grab some of this, bring that just a little bit farther down, grab a bigger pile of white. So this will be almost pure white. So very light gray. Okay, and that is fully mixed. So there we go. All right, so now we have a 10 different values going from pure white to pure black to use for our value scales. Next up, I'm going to show you applying this paint that we've just mixed to our value scales, and we're going to use 4 different paint applications.